So, what do you do when you can't see what's ahead? When there's no data to be found, or in the case of commercial real estate, transactions that tell us what a building might be worth or what the demand might be for that building? How do we thrive in a time of such incredible volatility and change, uncertainty, blindness?
You are listening to the AFIRE podcast, Real Estate, Technology, Cross-Border Investing, and the Opportunities of a Changing World. Let's start a conversation now.
Now, years ago, I came across this concept of the fog of war. And even as a non-military layperson, I found that to be a particularly provocative and useful metaphor for describing what you go through as a decision maker. So how do you decide when you can't see? The risk of making a blind decision is overwhelming, and that's just where we find ourselves right now in commercial real estate. We're blind, and we're trying to make decisions. So that's why I'm particularly grateful to be able to sit down with our guest today, the first week of April in 2024, to help us figure out how to navigate in this time of uncertainty and fog. General Stanley McChrystal. He spoke at AFIRE's February executive conference, and not only was he able to bring incredible clarity in thinking about the general geopolitical situation we find ourselves in, but also discussed in detail the task of managing risk in times like these. Stan is a retired four-star general in the U.S. Army. He retired in 2010, where he served as Commander, International Security Assistance Forces in Afghanistan, and previously served as Director, Joint Staff, and Commander of Joint Special Operations Command. Since then, he's authored several books, including My Share of the Task, Team of Teams, Leaders, and most recently, a marvelous book called Risk. He now serves as Senior Fellow for Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs and is the co-founder of the McChrystal Group, which is a leadership consulting firm. Thank you so much, General Stan McChrystal, for joining me on the AFIRE podcast.
It's a special honor to be here. Thank you.
So let's just start with this incredible book, which was shared with our membership, Risk, which just hit the stands, I guess, in the last few months. Fascinating read and so much to talk about. What prompted you at this point in time to write a book all about risk?
Well, it's interesting because people typically write about something they know a lot about. In reality, I decided to go after risk because I realized I didn't know much about it. Now, that doesn't mean I hadn't been involved in it. Like all of us, from the earliest age, I had been taught it in school. I'd been trained it in military situations. I'd been forced to use systems that we had. But, they never worked very well.
Yeah.
And then when I looked at larger organizations I was a part of, we never really got it right either. So I came to the conclusion that despite this really robust body of very thoughtful, some theoretical scientific work on risk, we're really terrible at it. And I wanted to understand why and what we might do differently. So we decided to add another book to the pile of risk books and take it on. We did not have a thesis when we started. The young lady who was my co-author, 25-year-old team member in McChrystal Group, we just decided to write this together and take this journey. She came at it from a different demographic, different background. She told me because she was from a large Italian family in New Jersey that it would be a bestseller simply through her family connections. So that was a plus. But the reality was we were both really interested in seeing why we're just not good at it.
So many people that have great ideas around risk and can talk about it endlessly. Certainly in the financial services world, we talk about it constantly. We worry about it. We have people in charge of risk. And yet, if you look at the record, we're not, to your point, not very good at implementing even the best thinking around how we manage risk day to day and how we lead in that environment of risk. So, all right, what did you learn in this process of reading the book?
I think the biggest thing I learned is that the greatest risk to us is us. And that's kind of sad on one standpoint, but the other standpoint, it's positive because we have agency over us. We can do something about that.
Right.
And so I think about the threats that are out there, and most of them, we're not very good at predicting when they'll arrive, but we sort of know that they are coming. So for example, COVID-19 seemed to surprise us, but it shouldn't have.
Yeah.
Pandemics come with real regularity, and we know what to do about them. Wars come with real regularity. Financial crises come with real regularity. If we look at Hurricane Katrina, 2005, that devastated New Orleans, in fact, that wasn't an unpredicted event. And so when we look back at our struggles to respond to all of those, in most cases, we couldn't predict exactly the nature of the storm or the war, the financial crisis, or the day it would arrive. But we could have gotten most of what was about or what was going to happen right, and we could have prepared.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we don't. And there are many things that we can prepare about ourselves and our organizations that you don't have to know the exact nature of the threat.
Mm-hmm.
You know that when a threat occurs, we'll talk about an organization of any kind of firm or a government. When a crisis strikes, what are the things that turn out to be really important initially? It's communication.
Right.
It's leadership. It's the ability to make decisions, to overcome that hesitation on decisions. The ability to coordinate different parts of the organization as you are acting. And so those things are all independent of the exact nature of the threat. But yet, if we take time to create what we called a risk immune system, suddenly you have a stronger body,
Mm-hmm.
a stronger firm, a stronger readiness to take whatever happens.
I'd love to visit that a little bit deeper on the why we resist those things that we can do ahead of time before these things happen, even though we know it's going to happen. I keep going back to the great financial crisis. Certainly in our sector, we knew it was happening. We knew years ahead of time that the CDOs were not going to hold, that it didn't make sense. And yet we continued to do what we were doing. Some folks invested into that and invested into shorting the entire economy, and they did very well. But for the most part, we all knew, and yet we did not act. We did not do what we needed to do to prepare for that. Why do you think that is?
I think it's an interesting thing that most leaders run into. When the weather's good and things are going in a certain direction, it's difficult for a leader to convince the organization or his stockholders or investors that we should pay money, we should invest in something, or we should stop getting a certain return, or we ought to, in the case of like a possibility of a pandemic, we should invest in vaccines or things like that, because in the moment, it seems like that's not very cost effective.
Mm-hmm.
You're buying insurance for something that might not happen.
Mm.
And then you go, well, but we do know it will happen. It may not happen today, but we do know it will happen. And yet there's this desire to either maximize profits or avoid irritating your constituency.
Interesting. That's certainly not been part of the conversation around AI and its impact, but it will impact leadership. I think that's interesting, and the need for us to be more courageous. So you mentioned the immune system, the risk immune system, which I think is a powerful idea. How, as leaders in our various firms and in the industry, how do we need to be thinking about building up our immune system? I have plenty of vitamin C in my cupboard, but what is it I need to do with risk?
Yeah, that's great. And I'll just go back a little bit to how we got to that analogy. I had studied the human immune system along with a Yale immunologist a few years before, and I had started knowing nothing, and now I know a little more than nothing, but it was fascinating. And the human immune system is this miracle. It detects the threat to our bodies. It assesses every threat. It responds, usually destroying that threat, and then it learns. So it's ready next time to be even more efficient against that threat. And you say, well, okay, how often does that happen? It happens about 10,000 times every day. Your body ingests microorganisms that could make you sick or kill you. And so when it's working, you don't think much about it. You get up in the morning and you don't say, please work for me today. But as soon as it's not working, then we see what happens. No one ever died of HIV/AIDS. Mm-hmm. It doesn't kill you. But what happens is your human immune system collapses, and suddenly you are vulnerable to all these little things that before would not have been a threat. Mm-hmm. So when you think about your organization, you say, I've got to be prepared for this particular threat from this direction on this particular day. And of course, we're not good enough to predict that and prepare that. So if we think of our organization, ourselves, like a human body, and we want to make our immune system strong enough, we came up with a series of factors, 10 to be exact, topped by leadership. But really, it starts with effective communication in the organization. Mm-hmm. It's the ability to act, overcome inertia. It is ability to get the timing right for the things that you do.
Right.
It is an understanding of structure. It is knowing what structures are actually helpful and then what structures are counterproductive that can work against you. And so in the times before the actual arrival of a threat, if you look at all those and you say, okay, how do I make them better? And people say, well, how do I look at them? Well, there are pressure tests. You can do tabletop exercises. You can do communications tests. You can go full blown and do what the military would call a war game. And that is to take your strategy and basically put it against an opponent and find out where the weak points are. Mm-hmm. Now, what the military finds in war games, you war game potential contingencies in wars, and the wars are never like you war game them. They never turn out like we predict, but they're always close enough so that the things that we practice, the muscle we built, the confidence we built, the relationships between individuals and organizations turn out to be the sinew that makes the difference. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly you found that you have this immune system that makes you able to fend off the vast majority of threats that come and either defeat them entirely or make them much less damaging.
And it sounds like much like a human body, it's all the work you do, the small things that make you healthy over time so that when you are threatened, you're able to respond, do what you need to do with that. I love the discussion around communication because I think we often misunderstand words for communication. If I just give you more words, if I just explain more, how do you define effective communication? What does that look like? And how do you help organizations get better at it?
Yeah. How often have you been in an organization where a leader goes, well, I told them, and you go, okay.
Yeah.
Particularly when you are communicating across generations or across cultures or across nationalities or across languages, it's harder, but it's always difficult. And so there are really 4 steps to this. Now, what I found is when I was operating in Afghanistan or Iraq and you're across from someone of a different religion, different background, you're very attuned to it. So you're sensitized to it, so you pay attention. But when you're talking to someone within your organization, you don't realize the importance of the steps I'll describe. The first is, can you send your message? And you say, well, wait a minute. No, can you means if I say it or write it, can it actually get to them? Is there an email connection or is there a voice connection? Can they hear? Are the conditions right for that? The second is, can they receive it? You've got to be able to, can they actually take it in? The next is the information accurate? Is what you're telling them either timely or appropriate or accurate? Is it of value? And can they digest it? Do they have the ability? So what we're really saying is it's not just what you throw out there. It's the receiver's ability to receive it physically, to understand it, to understand the language you're doing, and to make sense of it. Mm-hmm. When you've got all of those tests, then suddenly you may have effective communication. Of course, it's got to go back the other way as well. And there's just history was replete with times where just a slight misunderstanding, a misinterpretation of something that's written or said, and people will do something entirely different from what was desired or appropriate.
It certainly happens all the time. And I often wonder, even in our educational system, we have this assumption that we just open up the head and we cram some things in there and then, okay, you've got it. You've got the education. When it's actually an iterative process, it's a process where you're constantly having to check to see how it's been received, how the other person is thinking about it and all. It seems like it's very time consuming. Is this something that it's very difficult to keep doing or keep as a discipline?
The military has an interesting practice that we learned, and you have a mission, and the commander gets the mission and decides how he's going to give that mission to their subordinates. And you communicate it to them. Usually you issue an operations order.
Okay.
Then an hour or two later, those subordinates come back and they give you a back brief. And what they really, all their briefing is their understanding of the order. So they come back to you and they say, this is what you told me to do. And typically it's the basic mission statement. And by hearing it, this is what I think I have to do. We call them specified and implied tasks. These are the things I have to do to accomplish what you told me to do. Does that make sense? And then they'll also go into things like, and I think you're willing for me to accept this amount of risk in doing this particular operation, or accept this cost or whatever. And you're basically aligning. And we found some interesting things in it. First is you find that the issuer of the order often isn't as good at issuing as they think they are.
Right.
And when that back brief comes, they find, wow, what I told them either didn't make sense or, and so you align that. And then after that back brief, they can go forward and do detailed planning and then ultimately execution with much more confidence. And when you're dealing down chains in firms, particularly where you're dealing with different ages and levels of experience, that ability to go back and get an azimuth check, get confirmed that I know what you want me to do, builds confidence.
I love this idea of a back brief. I mean, we should add that to our lexicon, to our vocabulary, even within real estate and finance, because what a great tool that is. What a great way to enforce that iterative discussion, how you're constantly making sure and evolving as you go, in great part. And I love what you said in terms of realizing that, no, I didn't really say it right. I could have done a better job with that brief. Let me clarify, to give us that chance to get tighter and tighter and avoid some of those. I loved at one point a president once said, let's try not to make any stupid mistakes. We just want to make smart mistakes instead. I know that's an impossible aspiration, but really a great sentiment. Let's make sure that we're not missing it. Let's get it and get a back brief. I love that. And really what we're talking about here is translating all the things that you've learned in a massive organization, so much greater, with so much greater kind of life and death impact over millions of people in very complicated operations and methodology, and translating that into goodness, us in real estate. And you've had some experience with that, in that you've had, as a longtime client, Eastdil, which is a very respected member of our community. What have you learned as you've translated all the incredible things that you learned through your experiences leading our military towards something that's somewhat different, I would assume, than what you were seeing in Afghanistan?
It's very different, more superficially than it is once you dig into it.
Okay.
And I'll describe some of that. We worked with Roy March and Mike at Eastdil, and I learned a ton from them. And I'll describe some of this. The first is they understood that communicating with potential clients and longtime customers is about relationships. You build a relationship over time. It's like you do with your children, or like you do with your spouse or close friends. You have 1,000 conversations so that the day you have a really important conversation, that the communication is effective and that there is trust. And if you tell somebody, hey, this is a risk, you shouldn't do this, or this is a wonderful opportunity, you don't have to establish yourself because you've done that over time. That's expensive. And when I say it's expensive in personal investment, in just getting with the people who those relationships matter, because I don't think that happens just over the phone or over video calls. I think that happens face to face.
Yeah.
So to learn that. The second is, inside an organization, as we found in Eastdil, you had this unbelievable body of wisdom. And they started we helped them implement this cross the organization call that they did every other week, and they basically reviewed the situation of what was happening. They gave the intent from the senior leaders, what we're trying to do, so that everybody had a contextual understanding. But very quickly we learned that the wisdom is in different places in the company. It's almost in strata, if you think geology. The more experienced people like Rory March and Mike, they've been around forever. They've seen previous crises in the market. And when one would start to bubble up, they could say, this looks a lot like 1980X.
Right.
And the young people hadn't seen that. And so suddenly this wisdom is going. But at the same time, the younger and people closer to clients in many cases are saying, this is what we are seeing right today. This is what's happening. And so this communication is giving this sense across the entire organization of what the situation actually is, and then how they can put in the context of the experience that exists in that entire firm. When you have an organization like that that is willing to do that kind of sharing, it's very powerful. And in many organizations, because you have individual sales targets or responsibilities, you have the danger of incentivizing everybody to hold information close to the vest until they can execute theirs. And we found this in counterterrorism. We found it in the military. For lots of reasons, people just do that. When you can break that down and you suddenly realize you share this, suddenly everybody does better. You have a much better outcome. And so, and the market, just like warfare, I thought that war was a constantly changing, tumultuous experience. The commercial real estate market has got that beat in spades. And you talk about a complex environment where you're trying to make sense of what's happening. In the military, in the middle of a battle, you're always trying to gather information, figure out what the enemy's doing. And to be honest, you're trying to figure out what your own force is doing. Because once it gets confusing, it's hard to do that. So you have this very near-term challenge to make sense and make good responses. But the even harder challenge, if you think about the military analogous to real estate, the military will fight a war, and then there will be an extensive period of time, sometimes decades, before the next war. And during that interim, you have to train all your forces. You have to buy equipment that's going to be appropriate for the new war, and you're not sure who the new war is going to be with, or what the state of warfare when that happens will be. You are trying to do a prediction of what that market is going to be and how I can produce the perfect force to succeed in that market. And it's really difficult. We don't know. I say we don't always get it wrong. We rarely get it really right.
Right.
But it's a real challenge.
Incredible challenge. And it gets right to that first point when we started this conversation. We are in a period of time where the information is really hard to get. And in a lot of cases, we're having to fill in some pretty big blanks as we're trying to figure out where to go. And I based on what I've read, written by you and by others, there are many situations where you find yourself where you just don't know what's going on. So how do you approach that as a leader in times of particular blindness, if you will? How do you find sight?
It's interesting. It's changed a lot during my career and keeps changing now. When I was younger, you didn't have that much information or intelligence, particular specific intelligence. They did collect a lot. And I mean, relatively speaking, there was a fair amount, but you always were trying to get more intelligence. Then partway through my career, as more collections, satellites, airplanes, signals intelligence, suddenly the problem shifted. Suddenly you had so much information, the challenge was figuring out what the actual picture was.
Right.
You suddenly went to a jigsaw puzzle with 100,000 pieces, and you were trying to put it together in real time. And so some of the challenge was in learning how to curate that and how to sift through that so that you get that picture that you can get in real time.
Right.
Because you spend 10 years, you can put a 100,000 piece puzzle together, but in 3 hours, it's hard.
Well, and part of what I think is hard, and you've talked about this before, is the problems of bias. So as we're sifting through this huge jigsaw puzzle, we're making decisions about what's important based on our own lived experiences or our biases. So how How do you advise folks, or how have you experienced ways to get beyond your own bias?
It's extraordinarily hard. You have to train intelligence people not to. If we think of 9/11, the tragedy of 9/11, most people know that all the information to put together that plan and to stop it existed inside the United States government. We just couldn't connect the dots. Now that sounds damning, and you say, how stupid could they be? Well, the reality is connecting all those dots is harder than it seems.
No.
And so the first thing you have to do is develop a different freedom of thought, because the challenge with 9/11 was, as the 9/11 Commission report famously says, it was a failure of imagination. We could not imagine that Al-Qaeda would do something that audacious. I think that's true in markets and other things as well. We just can't get a mental picture of something completely unexpected happening because we've never seen it before.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are a lot of young people now that haven't seen a serious recession, as we certainly see markets, and you say, well, that can happen and the bottom can fall out next and next, and they nod and they go, I'm sure it can. But if you've never seen it and touched it, it's harder to conceive. I think we couldn't conceive of war in Europe.
Right.
If you'd asked 5 years ago, we'd say, yeah, Western Europe, people just don't go to war anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've got to think of ways in our organizations where we can expand our ability to be willing to consider the things that seem impossible.
Is part of your process for opening up against the lived experience bias, the scenario planning you talk about in terms of thinking about different, is that part of what helps train the system to think beyond what we already know?
It's a good part of it. It's not all of it. There's another way that we write about in the book, and I believe very strongly, and that's red teaming.
Mm.
And red teaming really consists of, in a military planning or war game sense, you have a blue team, which is good guys, and then you have a red team, which is bad guys.
Right.
And so what you do is you put together your plan, and then you have some people red team it. And if you do it right, you get people who are not involved in the planning, and therefore they're not biased toward it. And if you're really good, you get sort of clever, devious people, and they come and they find the weaknesses in your plan. Mm. In the year 2000, the United States was planning war potentially against Saddam Hussein, and they did a big exercise. And they brought on a Marine Corps 3-star general, and they gave him a team to be the opposing force, to be the red team.
Okay.
And at the beginning, everybody lined up to do this war game. And at the beginning, he did the completely unexpected. He did this out of the box. He did an attack. He was playing the role of Saddam Hussein. He did an attack where Saddam Hussein attacked to the south, went after the American fleet in the Persian Gulf, went after forces. It freaked people out. He caused a lot of casualties. And I'm not proud to say this, but the U.S. military said, okay, that's a foul. And they made everybody stop, and they went back and they restarted it. And then people talked badly about him for a while because they said he broke the rules. Well, actually, in my view, he was doing exactly what the organization needed. There aren't no rules in war.
Right.
And so if you realize that this red team will find the things that you just can't think about or you don't want to think about, and they will stick that knife in there and they turn it, and they show you that your plan is not quite as good as you thought it was, then suddenly you can fix it. Mm-hmm. And you can decide what risks I'm going to accept, which are reasonable, and which ones I'm obviously going to figure out a way to shut down.
It's interesting to me that you're almost creating, it seems, so much of when we really learn things is when we screw it up, when things don't work the way that we plan. We don't learn that much when everything goes according to plan. We basically become stupid. And you're creating that opportunity for learning, that break period. Of course, you can take a horse to water, you can't make it drink. And that sounds like what happened in that situation, because learning is painful. Having things break is painful. It's potentially embarrassing. It can even be kind of non-productive for one's individual career to have those sorts of things happen. And yet, that's where you seem to learn the most. What is it that you think, as you look back over an amazing career where you've done so much and you've known so many people that have done incredible things in the highest levels of risk and the highest levels of impact? What are the mistakes is there a mistake that stands out that you've seen or experienced or made that you learned the most and you think that we should learn more from?
Yeah, I think that, there aren't many mistakes I haven't made. And I was fortunate enough to work for people who understood that because you fail, you are not necessarily a failure,
Right.
because that's a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Remember Ted Williams got in the Hall of Fame for hitting 401 in 1941, but he failed 60% of the time he went to the plate.
Right.
And I always use that with people, and I say, remember that it takes a lot of failure to understand. I'll give you a sense of what we wrestled with in Joint Special Operations Command, the counter-terrorist fight. We had been formed as an organization after the failure of the Iran rescue mission in 1980. And they put together this wonderful organization, and we never understood that we were risk averse. Now, you say risk averse, you say, well, they're not courageous. Yes, they were. It was not the issue. They didn't ever want to go on a big mission for the nation and fail. And so as a consequence, planning became very cautious and conservative. You always wanted to have extra this and back up that and perfect intelligence, which means at a certain point, when you try to mitigate risk to zero, it takes so long that you've priced yourself out of the option. And so when I became the commanding general in 2003, one of the things we had to do was change that mindset in the organization, convince people that if we were going to compete against Al Qaeda in Iraq, we were going to have to fail a lot, because we were going to have to do operations that had a much lower probability of success. And all that mattered is we win in the end.
Right.
And so if we hit 401 and win, we're going to get in the Hall of Fame.
Right.
But that took an entire culture shift across the command, because people had just not been set up to do that. They'd not been shaped over their career to do that. So I think we talk about in America entrepreneurs and the value of good bankruptcy laws, because you have people who go out and they try something big and it fails, and they try again, and ultimately they're successful. And there's a limit to that. At a certain point, a person who fails a lot is a failure. But really get to the point where if you don't, he who dares wins.
Right.
And I think we've got to build that understanding that daring and failing is not a crime. In fact, it probably needs to be reinforced.
Right. And it seems to me that it may be one of the jobs of leadership is to create an environment where people can not just fail, but learn from the failures and share that lesson somehow across the organization, that each time something doesn't go right, that we all learn from it, we all get better. Isn't that what an immune system does?
That's right. The key part about learning, so they're ready next time. But too many of our organizations, if you try something in the firm and you lose money, shareholders get upset.
Right.
They look at that and they go, "That's a bad thing." And giving people a long-term view and a broad view of what you're doing really requires them to be engaged to the point where they understand that. Now we get back to communication, because you need to communicate that holistic effort so that those things can go into perspective.
You're absolutely right. It's that iterative sort of conversation that you have with investors as well. The real estate investor, someone who does it habitually, has to understand there's going to be some times where you're not going to feel good about this in order to get to the good times. And if you're jumping ship the moment something gets a little rocky, that's a good way to not make very much money. That's a great way to lose over time. It's almost like acceptance, just like a baseball player, of all those strikeouts in order to get the right hit when it happens. I think that's fascinating. And one of the big challenges that I know a lot of leaders, myself included, struggle with. All right, how do we manage our understanding and our use of failure as a tool versus something that we avoid at all costs? It's not easy. What is it that you think people get wrong when they think about managing risk? What is it that you think gets people in trouble that they're not seeing, or something that they think is true but isn't when it comes to managing risk?
I think there are probably a couple. I think the first is that you can avoid risk. You can avoid it by identifying it or predicting it, and you can just not be there when the threat shows up. And that's just not doable. And if it is, I've never known anyone who can do it. So I think that's number one. I think also judging people that run into a threat or have a problem as being bad risk managers, because look, risk causes you a problem, then I think that's a problem. And of course, it not only misjudges possibly that person, it also resonates across the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody learns that if a certain person tried something and it didn't work, and they see the consequences were not pleasant, nobody else is going to accept any risk, because they're going to look and they say, I don't want to be that person tomorrow or next week. And so I think we get that wrong. I think if you go back into some of the big financial crisis and whatnot, it's also this unwillingness to be realistic about risk. Because something is being reinforced, because you are doing some risky behavior, you are smoking, or you are drinking too much, or you are investing too much in something that's really risky, because it works for a while, you start to think, well, it'll work for a while plus one day.
Right.
And yet that's not going to happen. You just think it won't be today.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because some leaders bet big things on the part of their organizations, and you look back in the rearview mirror and you go, how could they possibly have thought that was going to be, continue to be a good outcome?
Right.
Because it becomes so glaringly obvious later.
Which, again, it seems to be a tremendous argument for leadership humility and an ability to look at oneself and look at your own decisions and why you're making them the way you are. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I've been honored and I'm incredibly grateful to have some time. We've been speaking with General Stan McChrystal, the co-founder of the McChrystal Group and author of the bestseller that is available now at your favorite bookseller, Risk. And I heartily recommend picking that up, especially in the real estate industry. Thank you so much, Stan, for joining me today on the AFIRE podcast.
It's been my honor. Thank you.
You have been listening to the AFIRE podcast. Remember to subscribe on your favorite podcast subscription service, such as Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitchers, and others. AFIRE is not engaged in providing tax, accounting, or legal advice. No content in this podcast is to be construed as a recommendation to buy or sell any asset. Some information included has been obtained from third-party sources considered to be reliable, though AFIRE is not responsible for guaranteeing the accuracy of third-party information. The opinions expressed are those of its respective contributors and sources, and do not necessarily reflect those of AFIRE.